start, before Calvert even existed, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of the very beginnings of Calvert and somewhat of a personal viewpoint, being that of how my own ancestors came to Robertson County, and Robert Calvert's family and their story of immigration here, but it was, of course, a very common story for many, many families. So there was a little town, or village, of Stirling. And you can see on that far banner there up at the top, that is the only known photograph of Stirling, Texas. And if you drive through Calvert and you go to the third light, the blinking light, just past the Dairy Queen, you turn left, go about 2 miles, and you turn right on Calvert Farm Road, and what's left of Stirling is the Stirling Cemetery. And Robert Calvert and his wife and grandson and niece are buried right there in front. There's 11 acres throughout, though, that have gravestones from the earliest pioneers from the 1850s, and many, many children and many immigrants, European immigrants. Some of it, you'll see entire families, with the loss of 4 or 5 small children, and it's really heartbreaking, but it really, truly tells the story of what people went through. So before Robert Calvert came along, before the Texas Revolution in 1835, Robertson County was a Mexican municipality called Viesca. And in 1821, Stirling Clack Robertson petitioned the Mexican government permission to bring settlers from Tennessee, Mississippi, and other states to Texas. And by 1827, there were hundreds of families hitting the trail with the promise of the fertile Brazos bottomlands for cultivating. Most of those immigrants came from Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. For many, many years, if you listen to people speak from the old families of Calvert, they all sounded like they were from Tennessee. And some still sound that way. So let's see, where am I? There was also a large proportion of European immigrants. Ireland, France, Poland, Germany. And after the war, and Texas became a republic, many more families began to move to Texas, and then Viesca was renamed by the new Texans as Robertson's Colony. So several hundred families settled near the fertile lands along the Brazos River and named their new town Stirling. Stirling became a thriving community, but Indian raids and disease were part of daily life. And a simple case of the flu or pneumonia, they didn't have the antibiotics, and it was many children and older people would succumb to a simple case of the flu. So you can only imagine the hardships, the fear of the unknown, the disease that the Indians, I believe the Cherokee Indians occupied that area. Sorry, I'm getting a little. When I was growing up, my biggest fear in life was speaking in front of a large group of people. So I think I still have that little of that in me. So as life became a little easier, Stirling became more prosperous, but it was based on the wealthy merchants and the wealthy landowners that benefited most. Of course, they all brought their enslaved workers along with them down to the Brazos Valley. You can only imagine what those individuals went through on that walk. So the planters had come to develop a cotton empire on the Brazos River. They knew that the cotton industry was the soil for the cotton was the perfect mixture of mineral content for the cotton plant to grow and thrive. So when the large wealthy families made their migration to Texas, they had brought with them their slaves, and you can imagine after that long journey, when they finally arrive, there was no rest for them. They immediately began cultivating the land, preparing it for the crops and the livestock. So Robert Calvert was born in 1802 in Tennessee, the son of William and Lucy Rogers Calvert. The Calvert family moved to northern Alabama when he was a child, where he married Mary Kazee in 1823, and yes, she was his first cousin. And Robert's sister married Mary's brother. There's actually a long line in my family of cousins marrying cousins, but that's the way that families kept their wealth within the family. My brother and I used to tease each other and say, "That's what's wrong with you," you know. But you kind of shiver at the thought of it, but it was accepted, and that's just how things worked. So Mary and Robert married in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where he ran a successful plantation until 1838, and then moved on to Stirling County, Arkansas, in search of richer soil. I'm going to go off on a little rabbit trail here. During one of our many military moves, we traveled from North Carolina to Wichita Falls, Texas. And Tuscaloosa, Alabama was pretty much the only place and the perfect place to stop and stay the night, get some rest. Well, our car was broken into, and they took everything of value and personal items, and we were devastated. We called the police. They reluctantly came and said, yeah, it happens around here. So, well, we got the VIN numbers for this and that, and don't worry about it. So I developed a little bit of a distaste for Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We had to duct tape our door closed and drove all the way to Texas with a duct taped minivan. So yes, I would try anything to be able to travel around Tuscaloosa to avoid it. But after that was when I began my genealogy research and discovered that the majority of my ancestors were from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, as was my husband's too. Yeah, maybe so. So anyway, so while in Arkansas, Robert Calvert served as a county judge and became very involved in the local politics there. But the land there became depleted from overworking it, and he decided that they needed to move on down to Texas with the promise of that rich soil, the promised land of Texas. And so he brought with him his wife Mary, their children, his own confidant, the Reverend Wharton, his Presbyterian minister, all of the neighbors, every last family member, and started their travel to Central Texas. And also, he also brought his numerous slaves. I believe at that time he had 60, which is hard. It's hard to imagine. So anyway, so he purchased several thousand acres along the land of the river near the village of Stirling and established his plantation there. His slaves were put to work, and they grew corn, wheat, and cotton, and raised livestock like cattle, hogs, and sheep. And the plantation became the largest operation in the area. It supplied many of the products needed to sustain life to the people in the village of Stirling. So again, Robert Calvert became very influential amongst his neighbors. And while in Stirling, he served as the state representative from 1853 to 1855 in the House of the 5th Texas Legislature for District 46, which comprised of Milam and Robertson counties. So while in Stirling, Robert Calvert had he put his slaves to work again to build a church, and they built a beautiful Presbyterian church made completely of the walnut trees that were from the plantation. And in 1868, that church was actually moved to Calvert by oxen and log, and it's still in Calvert today. It's beautiful, very well taken care of, and it still has services today.
Whereabouts is that?
Barton Street. So he's trying to tell me something. What? Oh yes, there's a picture of it. If you can see it at the bottom there. So yes, it is quite stunning. Some of the original windows are still in it that were shipped from France, I believe. The stained glass windows. Sorry? There was some remodeling done like 100 years ago, and so I don't know exactly, but from what I've been told, it's pretty much looks like it did then. So there's several other buildings in Calvert that were moved by oxen and log from Stirling. So Robert served as an elder there, and after Robert Calvert had died, that's when his wife and daughters deeded the church to the elders of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and that's when it was moved. But all that's left now is the cemetery. That is the only evidence left of the town of Stirling. And you can only see a portion from the road. And we, the Historical Foundation, have taken it on as a project to restore it and to make it safe for people to go and walk through and see those gravestones. In fact, we just finished restoring the front there of Robert Calvert, and we've got him sitting up straight now, and his 2-year-old grandson is with them, and his niece is with him and his wife. So that's just one of the projects that we work on as a foundation. So on with Civil War. With the possibility of Abraham Lincoln being elected as president, rumors came of the, go back, is that better? Am I echoing? Still echoing?
Stand back.
Okay, so with that election, the rumors, of course, came that the South was going to lose their way of life, and their culture of slave holding would be destroyed. So many of the men of Stirling and the surrounding towns in Robertson County voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy to fight for their way of life. Tensions rose between the North and South, and in April 1861, Civil War ensued. So hundreds of men signed up and joined the 4th Texas Infantry. Am I hearing this, or is this, I mean, the echo? You're hearing it okay? Okay.
You're too close. You're too close.
Is this better?
Lean back.
This better? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Civil War broke out, and men signed up with 4th Texas Infantry under William P. Townsend. By the way, the descendants of William P. Townsend still live in Calvert today. So Stirling became a mustering point for the 4th Texas. And during the various battles throughout the war, like Gettysburg and Gaines Mill. Many of the young men were killed, including Robert Calvert's only son, William. There are still many, many Civil War soldiers buried in the Stirling Cemetery. And on William was actually buried right next to his father, and on the tall marker on the side there, it has his son's name. I think he was only like 19. So as the soldier numbers diminished throughout the war, all of the Texas infantries were combined and became the Hood's Texas Brigade under General John Bell Hood. There is a historical statue of John Bell Hood at the Capitol. We hope it doesn't come down someday. But my great-great-grandfather, who served in the war, he was instrumental in getting that statue put in 1912, I believe it was. So it's special to me, and I would hate to see it removed, but we'll see. So, Robert Calvert at that time was too old to serve, so he served in another capacity, and he supplied soldiers with wool and cotton and food and horses and everything that they needed. And then in 1865, the war finally came to an end, and the South, of course, lost. So the thousands of slaves in Robertson County were granted their long-awaited freedom, but had nowhere to go. So many stayed on the plantations and worked for their former masters and worked for very minimal wages. The landowners had to comply with the new law and pay them for their work. And as you can imagine, there was much grumbling. Life became extremely difficult during the Reconstruction era. But in 1873, there was a large group of Chinese laborers that came via railroad to Calvert to work the cotton fields because they would accept the minimal wages. And the promise was that they would come and work and make the money and send the money back to their families in China. But that promise was broken. They never had to go back home. And so they settled in, and many of them married into the African-American people, and they became known as the Black Chinese. There's lots of things written about that community. It's very interesting. There's a historical marker also in Calvert that talks about that. And there's still descendants there in Calvert, like with the names of Chop and Yep. And so it's very, very fascinating history there.
How did they even find out that jobs were available in Calvert?
That's a good question. I think the idea was that they would come and build the railroad throughout the country. So Calvert wasn't the only place that these Chinese workers came, but I don't think that they got any further than Calvert, this particular group. So I'll go back and talk about the railroad. Of course, Calvert would not exist without the railroad. You can see up at the top, that top photograph has the first depot ever built in Calvert, and I believe that was possibly the first train that came through Calvert. So Robert Calvert continued to grow his cotton after the war, raise his livestock, but he saw the great need for that railroad to continue through Robertson County. It had stopped when Civil War broke out, And so he was on the railroad commission, and along with contractors Judge William Davis and Major William Hanna, they advocated for the extension of the Houston and Texas Central Railway to continue through Robertson County. They wanted it to come through Stirling, but the railroad company said, no, we can't build that close to the river for fear of erosion. It says, but we'll build 2 miles east of Stirling. Well, back then, 2 miles on horse or horse and buggy was a much longer trip than it is today. And so many people decided to pack up and move those 2 miles into the new city that was platted by Theodore Cossey. The town didn't have a name yet. And unfortunately, in 1867, Robert Calvert, in the midst of that move, that migration to the new town near the railroad, Robert Calvert died of yellow fever. So he actually never lived in Calvert. But so when he passed, the townspeople voted and decided to name the new city after him, hence the name Calvert. But his wife and daughters moved on and moved to Calvert. So, I think I've talked all about that. The way that Calvert was platted, if you notice, well, obviously you notice there's a major highway, Highway 6, going through Calvert. And the reason why it became that highway is because it was already built extra wide. And that Main Street Calvert was built extra wide so that an 8-oxen wagon could turn a corner. That was something to brag about. In the 1872 Texas Almanac, a piece was written by a young man who had been traveling through Central Texas, and he claims he saw a team of 20 mules maneuver a turn on Calvert's Main Street. The earliest photograph of Calvert was taken in 1870, and it's up there at the top. And honestly, it still looks that way somewhat, except for the dirt road. And the horses. Well, no, I'll see horses sometimes. See horse at the grocery store. The people from Stirling moved to Calvert as early as 1867, and so some of the first buildings and homes began construction in 1867. So the way the buildings were built on Main Street, the backs of the buildings were right up against the railroad, and so when the train would stop, they could unload the rail car directly into the store and vice versa. And there were 2 railroads, actually, one on each side of Main Street. I'm not sure how many years ago one was closed. I believe it was in the 70s. So the first railroad ticket office, telegraph office, I think I pointed that out earlier. Oh, right here. That was the very first depot. The telegraph offices were upstairs, the ticket office and the waiting room was downstairs. The townspeople were so excited to see that first train come through Calvert. They had never seen a train before. So they all gathered around and waited, and the first train came in June of 1869. It scared the horses half to death. And it was said people were covering their ears. They'd never heard anything so loud, but it was quite exciting, I'm sure. So now that the railroad had made its way, before Calvert existed, Stirling, Franklin, Port Sullivan, and Owensville were the closest trade centers. And so now that the goods didn't have to be delivered by horse-drawn wagons to ports like Houston, Nacogdoches, Louisiana, and further destinations, now they could be delivered by train, and Calvert became a center point for commerce. And this is a letter written by A. Grossbeck, and it states that for immigrants who were traveling and wanted to start their lives in Calvert and around Calvert could buy their tickets at half price and were not charged for their luggage. So it's a pretty good incentive. So many came by rail and settled in Calvert. So Calvert became a very important railhead and trade center of the booming cotton industry. The very core of Calvert depended on that cotton industry, and the rail delivered every necessity for daily life and provided jobs and commerce that sustained the flourishing economy. Today you hear people complaining about the trains going through Calvert constantly. The buildings shake, the windows shake, keeps you awake at night. But without the train, without that railroad, Calvert wouldn't exist. So you got to take the good with the bad, I guess. So now we'll get into the early days of Calvert. Again, cotton remained the primary business. There were 4 cotton gins up and running by 1880s. I believe this is the Gibson gin, which was at one time the largest cotton gin in the entire world. And it was even in the Guinness Book of World Records in 1912. But unfortunately, the gin burned down in the 1950s. So Calvert's busy Main Street was booming in its heydays between 1870 and 1900 when the cotton prices were high. There were at least 5,000 people living in Calvert in 1870. And by 1870, Calvert had over 50 businesses. The Sanger Brothers store was the first business to ever open in Calvert in 1868. That middle picture there with the wagons, those wagons have the Singer Sewing Machine Company was another successful business on Main Street. And the picture there is in front of the Singer Sewing Machine store, and those wagons are filled with sewing machines and sewing machine parts, delivering them. So there were 3 banks, countless dry goods stores, grocers, cafes, shoemakers, blacksmiths, tailor, dressmakers, pharmacies, farm implement stores, and of course, many, many, many saloons. There were jewelers and dealers of fine European goods like silver and china, and there were enough doctors and dentists to serve all of Calvert and then some. Many European immigrants came and opened successful businesses. French immigrant Jacques Adu opened a dry goods store and a private bank. Rudolf Oskar from Poland opened a 4-story hotel. That was the Grand Central Hotel. Unfortunately, it was torn down in the 1940s, and nobody really knows why, but it was very successful. J.P. Casimir from France was a successful druggist. Peter Franz of Germany opened a confectioner shop, because every city needs a little chocolate. There was 2 opera houses. People came from all over to see the theatrical productions and famous singers that would travel through. There was an active Masonic lodge, and the Masonic lodge, the organization actually started in Stirling, and so they moved to Calvert, and it's still active today. The saloon business in particular was quite successful. Lots of whiskey drinking and gambling. It is said that a person could see piles and piles of gold coins stacked high on the tables in the saloons. And Calvert soon had the reputation for a time of being a lawless town, and gamblers and thieves and shootouts on Main Street. Calvert was the Wild Wild West. Even the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus made regular stops in Calvert. There was a baseball field built, which still exists today. And on a little side note, the son of a black sharecropper and preacher learned to play baseball on that field. And he left Calvert when he was a teenager to try to be a professional baseball player. His name was Andrew Foster. So he made his dream come true, and not only that, he started the National Negro Baseball League. And during his time of playing, he acquired the name Rube Foster. I'm not sure what the name Rube really means, but that's how he was known as. There were churches of every denomination in Calvert. There was also a fairly large population of Jewish people, mostly who came from Europe, trying to escape, their lives back there, where lives were difficult for the Jewish community. But they were never able to build a synagogue, so they held their synagogue in the Casimir Opera House. And from what I saw, it filled the auditorium. And as far as I know, there's not a single Jewish person living in Calvert today. There were private and public schools for the children of Calvert, and up until 1969, Calvert had separate schools for the white children and the African American children. Calvert was a little behind the times. Calvert was once the county seat of Robertson County. And in 1875, they were building the county courthouse and jail. And before construction was finished, the county seat was moved from Calvert to Franklin. Calvert was very disgruntled. So it never was a courthouse, but it did serve as the county jail for many years. And that building is still standing in Calvert. It is the Norton House, Hammond House, as many people call it. It's the big red brick. It looks sort of like a castle. People a lot of times say, "What is that castle in the middle of Calvert?" Right now, it's privately owned, and it's been bed and breakfasts and things like that. But the actual jail house, the cell, there's several jail cells still in the house that you can go look at, and they're quite small. The jailer and his family would actually live there in the jail, in separate quarters, of course. And that house was featured on a show called If Walls Could Talk that came out about 15 years ago. It was very interesting. And at that time, it was owned by Bill Norton and his family. So the wealth of the cotton planters, they had the means to build large, extravagant homes. And many of the homes still stand today. Many have succumbed to fire, unfortunately, but there's still quite a few. And they are located in the National Registered Historic District in Calvert. By the way, Calvert is the third largest historic district in the state of Texas. And many people have no idea. They think that Main Street is all there is. But you got to go on the east side of Calvert, and that's where you'll see the beautiful Victorian homes, mansions. So those were Calvert's booming years. Great place to live, great place to move to. But unfortunately, tragedies came. four in particular, and affected the future of Calvert. And the first tragedy was the yellow fever epidemic of 1873. Let's see, over there. Tells you a little bit about it on that. In the autumn of 1873, that summer had been a very, very warm, humid summer with lots of rain, and the mosquito population was just exploded. And people did not know that you could get diseases from mosquitoes at that time. Yellow fever is a particularly nasty disease. Once a person is infected, usually they will die within 3 days. And it basically, they bleed to death internally. Horrible, horrible thing. Entire families were succumbed to it. Many children. Like I said, once they were infected, it was just a few days and they were gone. Another term they used back then was the black vomit. Sounds horrendous. The daily number of deaths were devastating to the entire community, black, white, wealthy, poor. They thought at the time that yellow fever was spread from person to person. And so when someone died of the disease, they would immediately burn their beds, their sheets, and everything that they touched. And as soon as they would die, they would immediately take them to the city cemetery and bury them. No matter what time of day, there was burials done all through the night, no services, nothing. They just wanted to get them under the ground and safe, from other people catching it. So the epidemic was actually blamed on a traveler that had come through Calvert on a train. He got off not feeling well and went to the doctor, and the doctor didn't know, what it was. And that man died a few days later, and then the doctor came down with it and his wife, and they both died. It was a mere coincidence, but the people of Calvert all blamed it on that traveler. Poor guy. The trains that would come through Calvert stopping in Calvert. They were ordered to drive right on through, and the windows all had to be shut, and nobody could get on or off. Very, very difficult time in Calvert. People didn't go outside walking, they didn't go to the stores, they didn't go to church, they just stayed in their homes and where they thought they were safe. I want to read a little bit about an article that I found in the Galveston newspaper. In October 27, 1873, the paper published this notice. 7 deaths yesterday, listed their names, and 9 new cases are reported. The next day, today there are 4 new deaths, and expect 3 or 4 more to die tonight. We are informed that people have left Calvert and do not intend to ever return. If true, this will cause the fever to spread, having raw material to work upon. And a final account, an evening account, says, I send you a complete list of deaths up to the present time. The disease is the most malignant form of yellow fever. Since the northers and the rain have set in, the number of cases of black vomit have greatly increased. 4 more deaths and 8 new cases this evening. The Galveston doctors here have done about all they can do and have left. The nurses, too, have left. Then it goes on to list over 100 victims by name as of that date. The number of black citizens were not even accounted for in that list of deaths. The epidemic took about 300 lives in total. About 1,900 people had become ill with the disease. Calvert was a very, very dark and sad place at that time. The second tragedy were floods. In July of 1899, the Brazos Valley received 7 feet of rain between July 1st and July 4th of 1899. The Brazos bottomlands, once with healthy growing crops and livestock, was completely wiped out. Livestock were drowned. Calvert was hit especially hard, and over 150 Calvert citizens became homeless and destitute. Refugees, in the number of 5,000, came to Calvert seeking help. The majority of those affected were the African American community that resided close to the Brazos River bottom. The merchants and farmers were, of course, also affected, but they gave out their goods and necessities that people needed from their stores until the stores were empty. Untold number of deaths. I don't know how many died. I don't know if there is even an account. And then there were additional floods in 1912 and again in 1921. The number three Calvert tragedy was fire. Calvert's been stricken by fires many, many times over the decades. In fact, we had a big one 2 years ago and lost one of the Victorian homes. But one particular fire that took place in December of 1901, a huge fire broke out and wiped out an entire Main Street block of businesses and killed one person who was living in an apartment on the second floor of a shop. He was a doctor. And the fourth tragedy of Calvert was the unprecedented drop in cotton prices. With the easy transportation of cotton by rail instead of horse and wagon, dropped the value of cotton and left producers there devastated. So many planters left Calvert to pursue other occupations. Today, the population in Calvert's about 1,200 people. There are, I believe I'm miscounted. There are many more people in the Calvert cemeteries than there are people living as of this date. The Calvert City Cemetery had been established in 1870. While the Stirling Cemetery became abandoned, there were so many victims of the fever of 1873 that are laid to rest there. And if you go to the cemetery, you'll notice all of the markers face one direction. But many of the victims of the yellow fever of 1873, their markers are slightly at an angle. And it was a superstition, and I cannot remember the story, but that's why you'll see those 1873 grave markers slightly at an angle. So the Calvert City Cemetery tells the story of how hard and tragic life could be in the late 1800s. So many children are buried there who had succumbed to disease, and families lost children. It was not unusual for a child to die in childbirth or die before the age of 4. I want to tell you a little story about my family who are buried, my ancestors who are buried there. If you visit the Calvert City Cemetery, in the middle of the cemetery, there's 2 large, beautiful angels. And those are my great aunts, Mary and Adelaide. And their 6 siblings are buried alongside of them. So, including my great-grandmother, Pauline Drennan. So those were the children of John Hill Drennan, a Civil War veteran, and Mary Garrett, the granddaughter of Robert Calvert. This is a particularly sad story, but I thought I would share it. The Drennans had 8 children. Their first, second, third, and fourth child all died before the age of 4. Their 5th child, Lucy, grew up, married John Glenn Glass. Glass died a few years later and left Lucy to raise her 2 children. Their son, John Jr., accidentally killed himself while playing with a handgun that he had secretly bought from a neighbor, but Lucy lived till the age of 85. The 6th child was Mary. Mary was attending Baylor Women's Seminary in 1901, which is now Mary Hardin Baylor. And she came home from Christmas break that year. She was upstairs warming herself by the fire, and her long hair caught fire. And she panicked and ran down the stairs while her dress caught on fire. And she inhaled the flames, and she died 3 days later at the age of 19. When I was going through my grandmother's house after she had passed, I actually found the letter that was written by someone from the university, a condolence letter, and it came with a package of her belongings and her artwork that she had done. She was studying art, and I still have one of her pieces of art in my house. It was very, very, very sad. Adelaide was the seventh child. Adelaide was 21 when she married Richard Westall. And only a few months later, she died of tuberculosis at the age of 21. The eighth child was Pauline Jane. She was my great-grandmother. She married and had 2 children, and Pauline Jane lived to be 89 years old, just shy of 90. As a child, I loved my great-grandmother. She was very, very sweet to me. And she was a walking history book, too. So, during Calvert's diminished population from the yellow fever epidemic and the lowered prices in cotton, the exodus of Calvert's citizens left Main Street, Calvert, frozen in time. A picture of the Victorian era of the pioneering days of Texas. It's that frozen in time aspect of Calvert that brings people to Calvert. In the 70s and 80s, it was known as the antique capital of Texas. Antique shops lined Main Street. The town has seen many ups and downs over the decades, but now we are seeing a definite revitalization. Almost every building on Main Street is occupied. There will be 2 new restaurants, a winery, art galleries, and we are in October. On the tables there's a gold card. It tells about a festival that we're going to have, and you could buy tickets for the meal on Friday night through the Chamber of Commerce phone number there. There'll be wineries, vendors, live music, all sorts of festivities. Everything on Saturday is free, so come on out. We, as the foundation, not only our project of restoring the Stirling Cemetery, we have always wanted to have a museum. Since 1967, Calvert's been trying to have a historical museum. Well, now we can finally touch it. The city has offered us the 2nd floor of City Hall, which is the original bank building on the corner of Hannah and Main Street. And so that is our biggest project. We're trying to raise funds to build that. But over the years, we've developed these banners and other items, and sort of been having pop-up museums that we bring things to events and whatnot. So we've been working hard, gathering items and history and information. So we're real excited about that, and I apologize for the one I broke this morning. So it didn't fall down. So, does anybody have any questions?